I don't remember putting the question mark at the, I don't remember writing the title, but What Games Need is a great title with a question mark at the end. What I want to talk about today is 3 things that game criticism is not useful for, and shouldn't be useful for, but yet that I see some lamenting that it isn't achieving. And those 3 things are, prepare to boo, these 3 things: improving games criticism, and making you feel good. So I want to talk about each one a little bit in turn. Let's start with improving games. So there's a position that's sometimes called technological progressivism that contends that the advances in science and technology proceed in a kind of consistent and deliberate manner from worse to better. And this isn't something that's unique to games at all. In fact, it's infected almost every aspect of technological society today. So iOS 7 is not just the next version of Apple's mobile operating system, but the world's most advanced form of interacting with a mobile device and so forth. But in games, the difference is maybe this. We think we have a kind of special exemption because our medium is not just a technological form, but also something like an expressive form or an artistic form. And it is hard, after all, to imagine like a community of operating systems critics getting together here in this room the day before Apple's Worldwide Developers Conference to lament and celebrate the role of the critic in the present and future of mobile operating system discourse or something like that. But given game development's general attachment to technological progress, we often kind of fool ourselves into thinking that aesthetics operates by the same progressive logic as science and technology does. Of course, a faster microprocessor or something, doesn't lead, we know this, it doesn't lead to more profound and more meaningful computational representation so much as it replaces it. That's what we do instead. But the very idea of a more meaningful computational expression ends up referring instead to whatever it is we can do with the obviously new and better materials of the present technological moment. So improving games just means making games today instead of making games yesterday. And this guarantees us future success. When we talk about the future of games, we're really just talking about tomorrow instead of today. You can't go wrong. You might as well just say, I'm making games. And what this move means for the critic is that the role of the critic as someone who claims that his or her work is improving games by drawing attention to the failings of the past and the opportunities of the future, that they become reincorporated into that discourse of technological progressivism. And that means that the critic who hopes to intervene in the gaming ecosystem by introducing interpretive novelty is actually, and rather counterintuitively, doing just the opposite. And instead, all we can really do as critics, the only possible alternative move, is just to treat individual works as subjects of deliberate analysis. That is to say that the only thing that the critic can reasonably do is write specific criticism on specific games. And this sounds really easy to do, but it's actually much trickier than it seems because it requires that we ignore the ordinary discourse of games or even oppose it. But we have to do that while also serving as kind of members of it in order to know what the hell we're talking about in the first place. We can't get outside of this domain of games in order to talk about individual examples. Okay, that leads me to the second failing, or the second error, that games criticism should improve games criticism. And this is really just a corollary of this first idea, right? That when games criticism becomes a domain that can alter and improve itself, then it risks subscribing to the same kind of techno-progressivism that it might hope to critique. So when we look at earnest and profoundly worthwhile projects like the ones that have been talked about today, Boss Fight Books, Press Select, Critical Distance, this very meeting itself, the scholarly online journal Game Studies, we might pause and ask whether these tools, all of which really do indeed hope to facilitate the production of individual analysis, whether they don't first create a circumstance that risks replacing the individual analyses they purportedly facilitate, right? So we're here not to talk about games, but to talk about talking about games. And if we're not careful, then all we do is talk about talking about things. Which doesn't mean that we should abandon doing so. We need some amount of this kind of discourse about our own discourse. But we also have to admit that there's a tension between facilitating a particular kind of platform for criticism, or for anything else for that matter, trains or whatever, and actually doing the criticism that the platform is meant to facilitate, rather than collapsing it back on the idea of doing that criticism. So if you think about something like Kickstarter or crowdfunding as a parallel situation, you can see what I mean. So on the one hand, platforms like Kickstarter facilitate the financing and creation of new creative works, games and films and coffee pots and whatever. But on the other hand, the Kickstarter campaign itself has quickly become its own entertainment activity. a replacement for the media the campaign purports to underwrite. We just engage with the Kickstarter, and that's sufficient. And in fact, whether the products even get created is kind of beside the point. And even when they do, they usually fail to meet our expectations for them. This is actually the same reason why we buy games from Steam sales or from Humble Bundles that we then never play. Because the idea of the game is so much better than the reality of the game. The idea is enough. And as critics, we shouldn't orient too much of our work toward this futures market of a hypothetical community of critics, but instead we ought to do the critical work itself for the sake of saying something relevant and important about a specific game for a specific reason. And the more apparatus we develop, then the more our work addresses that apparatus rather than particular games or trends in games in general. Okay, third, game criticism isn't for making you feel good. The good critic speaks from a position of remove, not just from remove from the work, but also at a remove from oneself. And unlike the artist or the designer or even the writer, the critic's work isn't oriented around the self, but around the other. And this makes being a critic not a very enjoyable job at all. And I mean that in a kind of ordinary, practical sense. Criticism isn't pleasurable. It's not as bad as being a coal miner or an actuary, but I guess at least miners and actuaries get paid for their work. But just as it is hard to do criticism for pay, it's harder to do it for gratification. And that's because the critic speaks in his or her own voice, not primarily to give voice to that voice, but to speak through it on behalf of others. And this is not because the critic is selfish. And in fact, when done right, criticism is ultimately generous. The critic doesn't create his or her own expressive output, but focuses the output of others. And this is how good criticism does this. It does it by answering one question, a question that's something like this: what the fuck is even going on? And this is the question that audiences don't even know they want answered. They don't know what to ask. They're just awash in this barrage of noise that the critic tries to tune into signal. What the fuck is my kid doing all the time in Minecraft? Or what the fuck, why can't I stop playing Flappy Bird? Or why the fuck is everyone talking about Titanfall? Questions like these. And this means that the critic must, above all, speak clearly and lucidly, and must speak to be heard rather than to have spoken. So while the critic can find pleasure or challenge in that craft of writing, just like the journalist or the cleric or the therapist, the critic's work itself sort of quietly abjures. It moves to the background. It makes way for itself. And for this reason, critics must take even greater care to refine their output. So the editor is not someone who kind of crushes the voice of the critic, but rather someone who helps fine-tune the signal that the critic's antennae plucked out from noise. And unlike the artist, the critic makes no appeal to something that had to come out. The critic answers questions, starting with the most fundamental question: what is this thing even? Why does it exist? And then the critic answers questions that offer relief to those questions. What do I do with it? What am I not seeing that I don't know that I'm missing? What will cure the sickness that I don't know that I have? So I want to stop and conclude with a question. It's an earnest question. Does game criticism even exist? When I reflect on this, when I started doing games criticism, or even using the word game criticism, it felt like a kind of word of faith, name it and claim it affair. The idea that there could be a games criticism, that one could exert the critical muscle on games, it just seemed unlikely and maybe even preposterous. And it was certainly at that time its own outcome, the curiosity that kind of replaced the example. And I saw myself trying out some methods and examples of that process rather than trying to found a field or a discipline or to become known as a game critic. And if those latter things happened, and I'm not sure they did, then they happened entirely by accident. So I'm not sure whether there is or isn't a games criticism community, nor am I sure if there ought to be one. And I think this might be the difference between us, us being, I don't know, the you I perceive to be the hopeful voice for a new generation of games criticism, which might have mistaken the state of affairs that preceded you as evidence that there was, in fact, an old generation of games criticism. Because, in fact, the era of fields and disciplines has rather ended. The era of critical communities may have ended. And the very idea of games criticism risks further balkanizing games writing from other writing, severing it from the rivers and the fields that would sustain it. Games criticism, you might even say, is a kind of subsistence criticism. There's just not enough land to till in games alone for the critic, nor for that matter in literature alone or in film alone or in toasters alone or anything. I mean, really, God save us from a future of games critics gnawing on scraps like the zombies that fester in our objects of study. So I have the impression that those of you who chose to be here today want a place, a community, a zone of comfort and belonging, that you might feel as though you were denied one that you deserve, and then in fact others might possess that, and then they might guard it jealously. But I'm not so sure if that's the case. I'm not so sure because I spend a lot of time in a lot of different communities as a humanist and as a computer scientist and as a journalist and as a nonfiction author and a game designer and an artist. But I don't really feel at home in any of these communities. And I think that lack of feeling at home, that absence of homeliness, is because at heart I really function as a critic. And the critical soul is kind of anathema to belonging. Belonging requires an immersion in first-order observations, and the critic must always be able to make second-order observations. But then once you start doing so, you can't go back. It's a Pandora's box. It's a red pill. Welcome to the desert of the real. Now you can only observe things about things rather than enjoy them for what they are. So if the artist takes mud and turns it to gold, to borrow a line from the 19th century poet Charles Baudelaire, then you might say that the critic takes the gold and turns it back into mud again. It's the inverse of alchemy, and nobody will ever call for an alchemist. No one will ever make room for that community. But in the long run, and even though they'll never admit it, I think the public would rather mold mud in their hands than store gold away in their closets. Thank you very much.